And I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Sergey Lavrov, Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation.
Distinguished Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, which was established as a result of victory in World War II, and the realization of the need for a collective mechanism to maintain international peace and security, unfortunately, this anniversary is getting closer, but regrettably the events of the Cold War, which started soon afterwards, prevented this tremendous creative potential from being unleashed. The hope arose again almost 30 years ago when the Berlin Wall, symbolizing confrontation of the two irreconcilable systems, fell. It was the hope for the possibility to finally turn the grievous pages of wars, not only hot wars but also cold ones, and to join efforts for the benefit of all mankind. However, we have to admit that although World War III was prevented thanks to the UN, the number of conflicts on the planet has not declined and enmity has not weakened. New and extremely acute challenges have emerged: international terrorism, drug trafficking, and climate change, illegal immigration, the growing gap between the rich and the poor. It is getting harder to address these and many other challenges from year to year. The fragmentation of the international community is only increasing. In our view, the reason for the current state of affairs is, first and foremost, in the unwillingness of the countries which declared themselves the victors in the Cold War to reckon with the legitimate interests of all other states, to accept the realities of the objective course of history. It is hard for the West to accept seeing its centuries-long dominance in world affairs diminishing. New centers of economic growth and political influence have emerged and are developing. Without them, it is impossible to find lasting solutions to the global challenges which can be addressed only on the firm basis of the UN Charter, through the balance of interests of all states. Leading Western countries are trying to impede the development of a polycentric world, to recover their privileged positions, to impose standards of conduct based on the narrow Western interpretation of liberalism on others. In a nutshell, we are liberals, hence anything is permitted. In pursuit of this policy, the West has been increasingly loath to recall international law, and more often and insistently dwell on the rules-based order, quote-unquote. The aim of such a concept is obvious: to revise the norms of international law which no longer suit the West, and to substitute it with rules adapted to its self-serving schemes, which are elaborated depending on political expediency, and to proclaim the West, and only the West, as an indisputable source of legitimacy. For instance, when it's advantageous, the right of peoples to self-determination is important. When it is not, it is declared illegitimate. In order to justify the revisionist rules, the West resorts to manipulation of public opinion, dissemination of false information, double standards on human rights, suppression of undesirable media, and bans on journalists doing their job. Moreover, the West has now got teachers' pets, so to speak, among their charges in the post-Soviet territory. Instead of collective work based on equal rights, closed formats outside of legitimate multilateral frameworks are created, and approaches agreed upon behind closed doors by a narrow group of the select few are then declared multilateral agreements. This is accompanied by the attempts to privatize the secretariats of international organizations and to use them in order to advance non-consensual ideas in circumvention of universal mechanisms. Attacks on international law have reached alarming levels. The U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA, endorsed by the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2231, is widely remembered. Washington did not just repudiate its obligations enshrined in this resolution, but started demanding from others to play by American rules and to sabotage its implementation. The United States has set a hard line towards eroding UN resolutions on the international legal framework of the Middle East peace process. It suggests waiting for some sort of deal of the century. Meanwhile, it has taken unilateral decisions on Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. the two-state solution to the Palestinian issue, which is essential for satisfying the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people and providing security for Israel and the whole region, is in danger. Apparently, when NATO members were bombing Libya, blatantly violating United Security Council resolution, they were also guided by the logic of their rules-based order. It resulted in the destruction of Libyan statehood. And the international community is still untangling the disastrous repercussions of NATO's adventure, with African countries affected the most. There are still hidden agendas in countering terrorism. Despite the universally binding Security Council decisions on listing terrorist organizations, some countries made it a rule to shield terrorists from punishment and to even work with them on the ground, as it's happening, for instance, in Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria. The United States has already been saying out loud that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is a rather moderate structure with which it can do business. A recent discussion on the situation in the Syrian Idlib showed that the United States is trying to convince other members of the Security Council to follow this unacceptable reasoning. The West also has its own rules in the Balkans, where it is pursuing an open course of undermining Security Council decisions on Kosovo and Bosnia. Universal conventions, together with Security Council resolutions, are an integral part of international law. The West would like to substitute even these conventions with its rules, as happened in the OPCW, whose technical secretary, I stress technical, was illegally granted attributive functions through unlawful manipulations and shameless pressure, in direct violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention and exclusive prerogatives of the Security Council. We're seeing continued games played with conventions that commit countries to upholding linguistic, educational, religious, and other rights of national minorities. Even here, our Western colleagues are guided by their own rules. They turn a blind eye to the open denial of national minorities' rights and abet the retaining of an ignominious phenomenon of statelessness in Europe. The course towards the revision of international law is also increasingly observed in the persistent policy of rewriting the history of World War II and justifying a growing number of manifestations of neo-Nazism and vandalism against the monuments to the liberators of Europe and the victims of the Holocaust. The key principles of the UN Charter, such as non-interference in internal affairs, non-use of force or the threat of force, are also being sorely tested. Now, we are now seeing the attempts to add Venezuela to the list of countries whose statehood was destroyed before our eyes through the aggression or coups inspired from abroad. Like the growing, overwhelming majority of UN members, Russia rejects attempts to return Latin America to rules dating back from the times of the Monroe Doctrine that America used to overthrow regimes and sovereign states, stooping to methods of military blackmail, unlawful coercion, and blockades, as it continues to do in relation to Cuba in defiance of UN resolutions. Next year marks the 60th anniversary of the Declaration of the Granting of Independence to Colonial Peoples, Countries and Peoples, which was adopted at the initiative of our country. However, a number of Western states are still clinging to the old rules, ignoring this declaration and other decisions of the General Assembly on decolonization addressed directly to them, while keeping former overseas territories under their control. This November marks another anniversary, 20 years since the adoption at the OSCE summit of a Charter for European Security and the Platform for Cooperative Security. These documents set out principles of cooperation for all countries and organizations in the Euro-Atlantic region. Heads of states and governments solemnly declare that no one should provide for their own security at the expense of another's security. Regrettably, the consensus reached back then at the highest level is again being substituted by a rule that NATO practices as it continues thinking in terms of searching for enemies while moving its military infrastructure to the east towards Russia and increasing its military budgets, although they exceed the Russian one by 20 times. We call on NATO to return to the agreements on shaping equal and indivisible security in the OSCE area. Recently, A number of high-ranking European politicians have been speaking in favor of this. In particular, this was demonstrated during the meeting between the presidents of Russia and France in August. The Asia-Pacific region needs a reliable and open security infrastructure architecture as well. It is dangerous to yield to the temptation of dividing it into conflicting blocs. Such attempts will be at odds with the task of uniting countries in the region in order to effectively addressing continuing threats and challenges there, including the task of resolving the whole range of issues on the Korean Peninsula exclusively by peaceful means. Now, actions taken by the United States, which following its withdrawal from the ABM Treaty destroyed the INF Treaty with the overwhelming support of all NATO members, have caused massive damage to the global system of strategic stability which had been established over decades. Now the United States is questioning the future of the New START Treaty, and they are refusing to ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Moreover, the United States has lowered the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons in its doctrinal documents. The United States is setting a course towards transforming cyberspace and outer space into an arena for military confrontation. In order to prevent further escalation of tensions, Russia proposed several initiatives. President Putin announced the decision not to deploy land-based intermediate-range and shorter-range missiles in Europe or other regions, if and as long as the Americans refrain from doing so as well. We called on the United States and NATO to join such a moratorium. We've also repeatedly suggested to Washington that we start negotiations on extending the New START Treaty. Together with China, we support the harmonization of a legally binding document on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. So far, the reaction of the United States and its allies has not been encouraging. We are alarmed by the prolonged lack of any answer to our proposal made to American colleagues a year ago to adopt a high-level Russian-American declaration on the unacceptability and inadmissibility of nuclear war, which by definition cannot have a winner. We call on all UN members to support this initiative. Today, I would also like to make an announcement. At the current session of the General Assembly, we are introducing a draft resolution on strengthening and further developing the system of arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation agreements. We invite everyone to engage in constructive talks. The adoption of such a resolution would greatly contribute to the creation of conditions for a successful holding of another NPT review conference next year. Russia will continue to work persistently in order to strengthen universal security. In this sphere, we are acting with utmost responsibility, exercising restraint, and enhancing our defense capacity, obviously not at the expense of effectively ensuring our national security, and in full compliance with international law. We support the consolidation of efforts to combat international terrorists under the auspices of the UN. In the interest of mobilizing the potential of regional organizations to counter the terrorist threat, Russia convened a ministerial meeting of the Security Council with the participation of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the Commonwealth of Independent States. Among the most critical tasks for the world community is the elaboration of broadly acceptable approaches to regulating cyberspace and understanding the processes related to the creation of artificial intelligence. Last year, the General Assembly endorsed the beginning of substantive work on discussing the rules of responsible conduct of states in the information space. A resolution on combating cybercrime was adopted at Russia's initiative. And it's important to work towards achieving legally binding agreements on all aspects of international information security. We need to step up efforts to facilitate the resolution of numerous crises and conflicts in all regions of the world. The main point is to seek compliance with already existing agreements from parties, not to allow them to invent pretexts in order to refuse to implement obligations already undertaken during negotiations. This concerns also conflicts on the post-Soviet territory, including the need to strictly follow the provisions of the Minsk package of measures to settle the crisis in the east of the Ukraine. In Syria, Where major success in combating terrorism has been achieved, the top priority now is the advancement of the political process led by the Syrians with the assistance of the UN. With the decisive contribution of Russia, Turkey, and Iran as guarantors of the Astana format, the establishment of the Constitutional Committee has been finished, which was announced by the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres a few days ago. Post-conflict reconstruction and creation of conditions for the return of refugees can now be tackled. Here the UN system is to play an important role. Yet on the whole, the Middle East and North Africa still face many challenges. We are witnessing what is happening in Libya and Yemen. Prospects for the Palestinian peace process and implementing the Arab Peace Initiative are on the verge of collapse. Efforts to play the Kurdish card, which is combustible for many countries, are alarming. The Persian Gulf region is facing an artificial escalation of tensions. We call on overcoming existing disagreements through dialogue without resorting to baseless accusations. For our part, we made a contribution by presenting this past summer the renewed Russian plan for collective security in this region. In support of efforts by the African states to put an end to conflicts on their continent, yesterday Russia organized a meeting of the Security Council on strengthening peace and security in Africa. At the end of October, Sochi will host the first ever Russia-Africa Summit. We hope its outcomes will help increase the effectiveness of addressing modern challenges and threats, and of efforts to overcome problems of development that African countries are facing. The reform of the Security Council is aimed at improving the UN anti-crisis and peacekeeping activities. Given the realities of the multipolar world, the main task is to find a formula which would correct an obvious geopolitical imbalance in its current composition and would ensure increased representation of African, Asian, and Latin American countries in the Council with the broadest possible agreement of the UN member states. Ladies and gentlemen, dividing lines are harmful not only to global politics, but also to the economy. Its inclusive growth is curbed as a result of the WTO norms being substituted again by other rules, methods of unfair competition, protectionism, trade wars, unilateral sanctions, and the blatant abuse of the status of the American dollar. All this leads to the fragmentation of the global economic space and negatively affects people's standards of living. We believe it's necessary to get back to substantive work both in the UN system and in the G20. To this end, we will contribute to the creation of favorable conditions, including through the opportunities offered by the BRICS, where Russia will assume the chairmanship in 2020. Together with other like-minded countries, we support the harmonization of integration processes. This philosophy lies at the core of President Putin's initiative of the Greater Eurasian Partnership involving the Eurasian Economic Union countries, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, ASEAN, and which is open to all other Eurasian states, including EU member countries. We have already started moving in this direction by interconnecting the development plans of the Eurasian Economic Union and the Chinese project One Belt, One Road. Consistent implementation of these endeavors will contribute not only to increasing economic growth, but also to laying a solid foundation in order to forge an area of peace, stability, and cooperation from Lisbon to Jakarta. Ladies and gentlemen, in the run-up to the next anniversary of the United Nations, I would like to underline the UN-centered system of the world order, despite all trials, remains stable and has a great capacity for resilience. It is a kind of safety net which guarantees, if the Charter is respected, a peaceful development of mankind by finding a balance of sometimes rather contradictory interests of various countries. And as we approach that 75th anniversary, the main conclusion is probably that the experience of non-ideological cooperation of states in the face of a common threat gained in the years of that most bitter of wars is still relevant. Today's challenges and threats are no less dangerous. Only working together we will be able to address them. Half a century ago, the prominent scientist and public figure, the Nobel Prize laureate Andrei Sakharov, wrote the following words: "The division of mankind threatens it with destruction. If mankind is to step away from the brink, it must overcome its divisions." End of quote. It was the unification which was considered the key task of the UN by its founding fathers. Let us be worthy of their legacy and memory. Thank you for your attention.
أشكر صاحب المعالي سيرجي لافروف وزير خارجية الاتحاد الروسي على
I thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation for his statement.